All right. So we left off with the Compromise of 1877. It brings about an end to military occupation and Reconstruction in the South. This is another Thomas Nast cartoon that would have been published in Harper's Weekly. Top left, we have the upside down American flag, symbol of distress, the war-torn Union soldier sort of bowing in defeat over the grave of the Civil War and the progress, a weeping Lady Liberty or Columbia, her broken sword, a triumphant former Confederate with the tattered Confederate flag flying, and then in the back we have destruction, we have war-torn South, and we have African Americans shackled again back in bondage. So this is a reference to essentially what will be passed as Jim Crow laws. We talked about who Jim Crow was. Jim Crow is not real. He is a minstrel character show, or minstrel show character who is a farce. He believes himself to be free, but in reality he's not. He believes himself to be educated, but in reality he's not. He believes himself to be upwardly mobile in society, but in reality he is not. And that's essentially what the Jim Crow laws are all about. On the books it looked as if African Americans had equal rights, but in reality that was not the case. So Reconstruction ends with the Compromise of 1877, and suddenly the local and state governments start to regain control, or former Confederates start to regain control of their land, of their political influence, and what this becomes known as is the Redeemer movement, the Solid South movement, the Home Rule. This faction of Southern Democrats will ultimately be referred to as the Dixiecrats. They're returning to the status quo of white rule. African Americans all but lost their voting rights, so a series of laws are passed with Jim Crow. There are literacy test requirements to vote. There are voter registration laws that are stringent. There are poll taxes that are collected. And there's also a really significant impact on what is called the grandfather clause, meaning if your paternal grandfather couldn't vote, then you couldn't vote.
That's dumb.
It's pretty bad. So what's important to point out here is that the Jim Crow laws also impact a couple of other groups. Poor whites are impacted because these laws keep them out of the voting block. And then there's another important group too that kind of gets forgotten about, and that is these large waves of immigrants that are coming over, right? So we have a large-scale group of Asian, Chinese, and Japanese immigrants coming to the West Coast. 1870, 1880 brings a large wave of Mexican immigrants coming into the South and Southwest, and a large-scale group of Western and Central European immigrants coming from Ireland, Italy, Russia, Greece. A number of new countries are bringing immigrants over, so you're going to start seeing these voting restriction laws spread beyond the South. Really, all African Americans are targeted by these laws, and the laws obviously perpetuate, or the Jim Crow laws perpetuate the black codes, but also the system of sharecropping. Sharecropping is a lot like feudalism. You can live on the land, but you can't own the land. You can work the land, but you can't own all that you reap, right? Part of that has to be shared. And then you get into large-scale debt because you owe money for equipment, or you owe money for rent to live there. And maybe you have a glut in your particular crop and you can't grow enough, but the debt keeps piling up. The really tragic court case that will ultimately decide the fate of African American equality for more than 60 years, because it looks like it's close to 60 years date to date, but it's really more like 70, 80 years, even to a degree, 100 years for many people in the United States. This 1896 case was between Homer Plessy and Justice John Ferguson. Homer Plessy is considered what would have been mulatto in the census at this period of time. He was of mixed race. He was about 1/8 African American. He got on a streetcar in New Orleans. And at this period of time, transportation was segregated. You had your white streetcars and your African American streetcars that would have been deemed colored streetcars. He got into a white streetcar. What's really pretty wild too, he lived in, for the most part, an integrated neighborhood at this time. He's arrested, he's tried, and he appeals the case. So the case becomes known as Plessy v. Ferguson because he appealed the decision by the original Justice John Ferguson. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court really sort of shocks the nation because only one justice ruled in favor of Plessy. It was almost a unanimous decision in favor of Ferguson, saying that separate transportation that was equal did not violate civil rights. But as we're going to find out, streetcars, buses, later buses, railroad cars, water fountains, schools, every facet of anything of public use, and for the most part, everything of private use was segregated. And this is continued until 1954, when the case is reversed as a result of what famous Supreme Court case that's decided in 54. Yeah, good job. Brown v. Board. Awesome work. May 17th, 1954. So, with that being said, in the Brown v. Board case, people still fought this, right? Especially in the American South, where some individuals don't really become integrated until the 1970s, and you don't start to see the real deterioration of Jim Crow technically into the 1990s, like in all public and private locations. So this is a pretty sad moment in American history, because Jim Crow, as African Americans moved out of the South to get away from sharecropping, to get away from the racism, to get away from the Jim Crow follows. And I'm going to teach you guys we're going to talk more about the Great Migration as we move forward. So here on the left, we have Jim Crow. On the right, top right, this is a cartoon in reference to Plessy versus Ferguson. And on the bottom right, this just shows you what Jim Crow did, all that it segregated, down to water fountains.
People are so petty because you can't share water fountain.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's horrible. Yeah. So,
have you seen the movie The Help?
oh yeah.
That just reminded me.
Powerful film, for sure. But I want you all to keep in mind that class conflicts are not just isolated to African Americans. Every immigrant group, poor whites, were in the middle of widespread class conflict. Do keep in mind this is another beginning of the rise of the labor union movements. I'm going to teach you more about those later. Knights of Labor, American Federation of Labor, the American Railway Union, etc. So really in the post-Civil War era, the first large-scale group of labor force to rise up on a national platform was rail workers, and it led to the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, also known as the Great Upheaval, and it started with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in Martinsburg, West Virginia. You guys are probably familiar with Martinsburg if you've ever traveled north on Interstate 81, like you're heading up to Pennsylvania and New York. It's just west of the DC metro area because the Baltimore and Ohio rail line cut wages. This also leads to friction between races. So in the east, especially in the northeast, a lot of battling between African American and Irish laborers. And in the west, we see a large wave of Chinese and Japanese immigration during this era, and a lot of like deep-seated anger and infighting between Chinese laborers and Irish laborers. Really, if you think about the majority of the labor force that was working from on the Transcontinental Railroad line from Omaha, Nebraska to Utah, the majority of that group were Irish or Western European or Civil War veterans, and in some cases African Americans that are moving west to take advantage of their freedom. Most of the people building the line from Sacramento to Utah, they were Chinese and Irish. The Chinese were actually the ones that they were the laborers that would do the most dangerous jobs, and they were paid a fraction of what they deserved. The labor struggle between the Chinese and the Irish reached a tipping point in San Francisco when Dennis Kearney, labor rights leader, who founded the Working Man Party, actually clashed with Chinese labor in the streets of San Francisco, and it turned into a brawl that led to bloodshed, and it pushed across a west to east coast bill that was issued in 1879 and passed in 1882 called the Chinese Exclusion Act that limited Chinese immigration coming into America. The way that they sort of pitched this was Chinese weren't assimilating, fearful that that Asian immigrants would ultimately try to take control of the West Coast. The irony is that they were doing what everybody else was doing, trying to get over here, have political opportunity, religious freedom. There's a real, this was an era where there's a lot of civil unrest and a lot of expansion of imperialism in China in this period of time. Gang violence in China was at a peak. In fact, some gang syndicates in China had more control than governments did at the turn of the century. So a lot of people are trying to get away from that in order to be able to live the American dream. One thing that the Chinese wanted, just like everybody else, and this kind of got lost sort of along the way, is that they wanted to see expansion of public education. They wanted their kids to get an education, get jobs, you know, there's a bit of a smear campaign. One thing in particular that the Chinese are able to bring over that China has outlawed, but it was still being traded anyhow, and the United States had not yet outlawed, was opium. So the opium trade becomes big business, but there are a lot more Chinese workers working on the railroads, they get real big in the laundering service in the West Coast, and they get pinned as like, oh, every Chinese laborer is smoking opium and selling opium and establishing opium dens. Did Chinese immigrants come over to establish opium dens? You betcha, they did. But they took advantage of an opportunity. Not to mention the fact that the entire opium trade at the turn of the century was being done by American shipping families. So the Delanos, the Peabodys, all those families that built Harvard and Yale and the Ivy League institutions up during this era, they did it on the opium trade. So, and who were they involved with? The crime syndicates. So it's a really interesting history. It's a really good book that's been written on the topic that I would recommend. It's called The China Mirage, written by a guy named Bradley. He's the guy that wrote Flags of Our Fathers. worth your time. Talk just deals with early U.S., Chinese, U.S., Japanese, and U.S. Korean foreign relations. So this is the first major anti-immigration act. We've got in American history, we've got the Chinese Exclusion Act. The WASP, much like Puck magazine I was telling you about, was a satirical magazine. This is just a political cartoon that's purposely made racist to dig at the sort of hypocrisy of the Chinese Exclusion Act, basically meaning that Chinese are making their way to America, and obviously they've depicted the Great Wall as a stereotype here, shutting the door on potential immigration. The top right is a different cartoon. The bottom right, another stereotype that the magazine, I think this one was published in either Puck or Judge, trying to like sort of feed into a stereotype of the Chinese involved in the laundering service. And that's another problem too. They want to build business. They want this economic opportunity, but a lot of them are going. A lot of the Chinese immigrants are going to lose their land rights after the passage of this act. Jazz, you have a question. What's up, bud?
Was it all was this bad just in America, or where was everyone else excluding other people?
Oh, yeah, there were other anti-immigration laws, and I would say that.
Like in other parts of the world.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you have to also think about this is an era of global imperialism, right? So, like, we're getting on the imperialist scene. So, our imperialism spreads out just like the rest of Europe, and that's another thing to consider in terms of like not only limiting immigration, but also treatment of foreigners, like the imperial land grabs in Africa, imperial land grabs in India, imperial land grabs in the South Pacific, imperial land grabs in China, Korea, Manchuria. Like, everybody's vying for these places for resources and ports of call, and then not willing to provide rights to those people, nor are they interested in allowing those individuals to immigrate, right? We're going to see a major tightening of immigration restriction in our post-World War I era, and that's where we sort of had like this era of imperialism, growth, large waves of immigrants coming in, and then we start to close the doors in that post-war era. European nations, we could find similar laws that they passed. There's a really interesting author. His name is Lowen's. I'll look him up. Lowen. He writes like about like an international sort of. He has like more of an international perspective. He wrote a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, where it's like all of these like things that have gotten recycled in textbooks that aren't like it's not like objective history, right? Well, he has an international sort of approach too, where he like picks apart all types of different countries that have not presented their history in the way they should have, and he deals with immigration in those countries as well. Another thing I want you to think about too is it's not just China and Japan, it's also there's like major civil unrest in a lot of these European countries that lead to their people coming to America as well. So, what's up?
When did World War II start?
Well, technically, it started when Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, but some would say like the real beginning of World War II, like the sort of beginning, is the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. Yeah, so we'll talk about that later. Technically 39. So let's talk a little bit about James Garfield, Civil War veteran, brilliant mathematician, actually proved the Pythagorean theorem. He was a professor of math at Hiram College. He ran against another Civil War hero, the hero of Gettysburg, Winfield Scott Hancock. Both of these guys were veterans. Both had been sort of well respected in the Grand Old Army of the Republic. Winfield Scott Hancock had been wounded at Gettysburg. This is a pretty close one. What helps tip the balance for Garfield is, remember that the Republican Party isn't splintered into factions. He actually runs with a stalwart. A stalwart would have been like a guy that had been part of Roscoe Conkling's sort of political machine, one of Conkling's political cronies in New York. And that guy was Chester A. Arthur. So he's appealing to the conservative base. He's appealing to the liberal base. Another way that he appeals to the conservative base, he is anti-greenbacker. He's anti-bimetallism. He's about returning to a gold standard, printing less inflationary tactic type cash, and less minting of silver bullion. So he is elected. Ironically, he runs on a platform for civil service reform, meaning that people that get government jobs should have to be vetted. They should not get their jobs by who they know, patronage and nepotism, this good old boy system, or sort of a tactic of who you know, not what you know. Well, Garfield wants to move away from that. Ironically, his own policy, in a way, kind of killed him. Illinois office seeker and clinically insane Charles Guiteau was a spoil system kind of guy. He had met Garfield once. You keep in mind that presidents, whether at the White House or if they were in public, if they took part in a like sort of a lineup to meet office seekers or meet friends and supporters, they might stand around for 4, 5, 6 hours shaking hands and listening to everybody's grievances and saying, hey, you know, I'm Charles Guiteau, I'd really like a job. I'd like your support. Well, in the mind of Guiteau, he feels like he's met the man. He campaigned for him. He had voted for him. Well, he deserved a job. That's what the Republicans had done in the Grant era and in the Hayes era, even though Hayes was making a move toward getting away from sort of this civil service. Even though the civil service reform sort of kind of got started with Hayes, Arthur wanted to see it through. So, I'm sorry, Garfield wanted to see it through. Arthur does see it through. So Garfield is boarding a train in D.C. on July 2nd, 1881, and with a concealed handgun, pistol, Charles Guiteau comes up on Garfield and shoots him in the back. He is rushed to a doctor. The wound is not considered severe, but it's infected. So they're going to do some surgery. And then, any idea why he dies in September in New Jersey and not in D.C.? Yeah.
Heart attack.
No, he actually dies of an infection from the bullet and the wound itself. Yeah. No, they didn't keep him in D.C. on purpose. The reason they moved him up there is because if you look at this time of year, July and September, they believe that the salt air in near Atlantic City would help him heal faster. So they took him to New Jersey to try to let the salt air help him out, but he still ends up dying of disease. Guiteau tries to plead with an insanity defense, but he was convicted and executed for the crime. So on the top left, we have Garfield. Top right, Charles Guiteau. Bottom left, the assassination. And then on the bottom right, a political cartoon, An Office for Your Life. So Chester A. Arthur is sworn into office. So in that 1 year, three people held office in one single year. Bless you. Rutherford B. Hayes leaves office. Garfield is assassinated, and Arthur becomes president. Arthur actually sort of gives a cold shoulder to the guys that rose him up, the stalwarts, Roscoe Conkling's band of sort of crony politicians in the Republican Party, and he pushes forth the Pendleton Act, which had actually, this whole idea had started around the time that Hayes was in office, because they wanted to get away from the widespread corruption that everybody had to live through during the Grant administration. This is worth your time. It's on your review. Take a look. Pendleton Act. It's a civil service reform act that grants government jobs based on merit and ability, not based on patronage. It also leads to this, the Civil Service Commission. This is charged with sort of administering an open competitive service, or competitive service for jobs that were not classified by the president. So what's interesting here is that Arthur, a man who rose to the ranks in politics due to patronage, ends up passing the largest anti-patronage piece of legislation to date at this point. He also revitalizes the United States Navy and does not seek re-election in 1884. Arthur is also sort of what we would consider, I don't know, a very fashionable, I'm trying to think of, I guess you would call him, some people would call him like clothes horse, fashionable male. You ever heard that term before? Clothes horse? Okay. It's like a guy who buys a lot of clothes, right? Always like sort of keeping the most up-to-date fashions. And his entire wardrobe was commissioned by Brooks Brothers. Y'all familiar with Brooks Brothers? Like, cheapest suit you can buy from Brooks Brothers is like $4,000, right? So, yeah, he helps put Brooks Brothers, well, they both kind of put each other on the map, right? Help me out with a brand that would be comparable to Brooks Brothers. Gucci. There you go. There you go. All right. So this is how Arthur was sort of seen. The progress of snobbery. Also a big fisherman. Spent a lot of time sort of with a leisure schedule with his time in the White House. All right, let's talk a little bit about the Readjuster Party. The Readjuster Party is a movement in Virginia it's a political coalition that is formed by moderate Republicans and liberal Democrats after the American Civil War and toward the end of the Reconstruction period. The Readjuster wanted to break down the power of the wealthy and the elite in Virginia and wanted to provide opportunity for poor whites and African Americans. The platform: settle the state debt following the Civil War, end the poll tax in Virginia, provide for civil service reform for poor whites and African Americans, and provide public education to remote areas and rural areas for African Americans and poor white children. The The party was led by Civil War General Billy Mahone, who was one of Lee's generals. He was a railroad magnate from Petersburg, Virginia, also a VMI graduate, class of 1847. And then attorney Harrison H. Riddleberger from Woodstock, Virginia. Both of these guys were former Confederates. Riddleberger owned a newspaper in the Valley of Virginia. Ultimately, they were toppled. They had a significant run from the 1870s into the 1880s, but they lost control to conservative Democrats led by Fitzhugh Lee, Robert E. Lee's nephew. Fitzhugh Lee is really one of the guys that sort of spearheads the what we would consider sort of a Dixiecrat type of movement in the post-war era, limits on rights of African Americans, and the push for Jim Crow laws. So here we have Billy Mahone on the left, Harrison Riddleberger on the right. And then this is where we're going to pump the brakes today. We've got the election of 1884 between James G. Blaine of Maine and another sort of interesting candidate, Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland is your only candidate in this era that did not have Civil War service. All of your candidates, not every candidate, I'm sorry, all of your presidents from Grant to McKinley had Civil War service. James G. Blaine had been involved in a lot of the political corruption and monetary corruption during the post-Reconstruction era. And this leads to a group that leave the Republican Party and join the Democratic Party to vote for Cleveland. This group became known as the Mugwumps. Sounds familiar, right? Sounds similar. It's kind of like the group that left the Democratic Party to join the Republican Party in the South, notably James Longstreet. What do we call that group? Not carpetbaggers, but scalawags. Good job. All right. So the Mugwumps actually turned the tide of the election in favor of Cleveland, and he ends up winning a real narrow popular vote, and he gets 219 in the Electoral College. Here on the top we have James G. Blaine. On the bottom, it's a cartoon in reference to the Mugwumps. It says Republican Revolt. And they're hiding behind the papers, and you can't really see it, but he's completely tattooed. His whole body is tattooed with all of the corruption scandals that he was involved in. He's wearing sort of a Robin Hood type hat, and he's covering himself up with newspaper articles. Yeah.
Do you think that the corruption started with Blake's candidacy, or was it?
I think there's always been corruption to be found in any administration gets hit with corruption, you know. And we could dig around in every presidential term and find, but Grant's was the most widespread corruption. Prior to that would be James Buchanan. He had a real corrupt term in office prior to Lincoln coming in. I mean, the Lincoln years were even corrupt. So, all right. So I think this is a good time for us to stop. So just